Hello students, welcome again. In today's video lecture, we want to discuss T.S. Eliot and his contribution to English criticism. Particularly, we will focus the discussion on his critical essay. The title is Tradition and Individual Talent. In order to understand Eliot's critical theories on poetry and art, we need to compare and contrast Eliot's criticism with the previous critiques like Matthew Arnold, William Wordsworth, and S.T. Coleridge. Friends, when we study the 19th century criticism, the most of the critics like Wordsworth and Coleridge, they adopted a subjective approach to art. Subjective means personal approach to art. But if you come to the 20th century criticism, which is also known as new criticism, it is different from the previous traditional criticism of the 19th century. And that is why, because it is different from the 19th century, that is why, the 20th century criticism is also called new criticism. And T.S. Eliot, whose full name is Thomas Stearns Eliot, is one of the most important founding pillars of this new criticism during the 20th century. He has been considered as one of the most influential figures in the sky, in the firmament of English literary criticism in the beginning of the 20th century. Thomas Stearns Eliot, who is also known as a great poet, also established himself as a great critic of new criticism during the 20th century. As I told you, we are going to discuss his views on tradition and individual talent. It is a critical essay which was published by Eliot in the year 1919. And this essay is bubbling with very important critical principles discussed by Eliot. The mark of Eliot on the whole map of literary criticism is very strong and very deep. And that is the reason why there are hundreds of critics who have appreciated T.S. Eliot not only as a poet but also as a great critic. One of them is John Hayward. John Hayward, he says that I cannot think of a critic who has been more widely read and discussed in his lifetime. Means, Hayward wants to compare Eliot with other critics, and he says that there is no other critic in the whole history of English criticism who has been so much discussed and so much widely read by the scholars and readers of English literature. Not only in English language, in all the languages of the world, T.S. Eliot's critical remarks, his views, his new critical theories have been translated in all literatures, in all languages except Russian language. So that is what John Hayward wants to say. See, when we are studying T.S. Eliot, we find Eliot as placed against romantic and moral approach of the 19th century criticism. As I told you in the beginning, to understand Eliot, you need to understand the 19th century criticism. To understand day, you need to understand night. In the same manner, when T.S. Eliot started writing and expressing his critical theories in the beginning of the 20th century, he found himself face to face with some great past theorists during the Romantic revival like William Wordsworth and some Victorian critics like Matthew Arnold. We know that Wordsworth was a critic who gives much importance to the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So, poetry, according to Wordsworth, is the natural expression of the personality of the poet. It is a natural expression of the poet's emotions and experiences. But T.S. Eliot was not much satisfied with this idea. In the same manner, during the Victorian era, Matthew Arnold, who was a predecessor of T.S. Eliot, he also advocated for morality in poetry. He believed that poetry must release some moral messages to the society. But T.S. Eliot was not satisfied with this moralistic approach and personal approach towards poetry. And that is why if I use the words of Hamlet, Hamlet, a tragedy written by William Shakespeare during the 16th century, if I use the words of Hamlet to express the feelings of T.S. Eliot at that time, then I must say that the time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Indeed, T.S. Eliot, who was not satisfied with this current scenario of the Victorian and Romantic criticism, he was the man who thought that it is my responsibility to set poetry in the right direction, and that is the reason why he published this critical essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, in the year 1919. Now, Eliot goes against William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth gives the definition of poetry which is very personal, but Eliot gives the definition of poetry which is highly impersonal. Eliot gives much emphasis on restraint, on control, and he does not support the idea that the poets are inspired by God. Just like Plato believed these things, Wordsworth also believes that poetry, the poets are inspired by something unknown. No, he says that writing poetry is an organization. It is an art of organization. Okay, and poet should not be given any freedom to say whatever he likes in poetry. As a critic, he puts restraint, he puts control over the poets. Eliot, for the first time, he rings the bell and he proclaims, he protests against the general scenario, and he said that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions. It is an escape from emotions. He says that poetry has nothing to do with the emotions of the poet. Poetry is not the expression of the poet's personality. It is an escape from the poet's personality. So according to him, poetry is different and the poet is different. This is called objective approach. This is called scientific approach to poetry. And that's why Eliot's definition of poetry is considered as impersonal definition of poetry. And this is the main argument raised by Eliot in Tradition and Individual Talent. According to him, when the poet wants to write poetry, he has to remain absolutely away, absolutely free from his personal emotions and he experience and his past experiences. Okay, according to him, the man who experiences is different and the poet who writes poetry is different. Okay, and that is why his view about poetry, his theory on poetry is known as impersonal theory of poetry. Now, according to T.S. Eliot, writing poetry is a scientific process. We know that T.S. Eliot lived during the first half of the 20th century, and the beginning of 20th century is the period of the development of science and technology, and Eliot was much influenced by the scientific development during his times, and that's why when Eliot discusses poetry, his approach towards poetry also it is scientific approach. He has adopted this scientific approach in his theory of poetry, and he compares the art of writing poetry with some chemical process. If I use his own words, as you can see on the screen, he says that when the two gases, which gases? Oxygen and sulfur dioxide. When these two gases are mixed in the presence of a filament of platinum, they form sulfurous acid. He gives an example from chemistry, and he says that if you want to make sulfurous acid, you need to mix these two, oxygen and sulfur dioxide. But these two are unmixable. Okay, to mix them, you need the presence of a filament, which is a rod of platinum. This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. And at the end, when you get sulfurous acid, there is no mark of that sulfurous acid on the filament, and there is no mark of filament on the sulfurous acid. Both are detached, both are different. In the same manner, Eliot wants to say that when a poet wants to write poetry, he needs to mix up various things. What various things? The poet mixes his emotions, feelings, his thoughts, and his past experiences. Okay? And to mix them, the mind of the poet is used as a filament, without which the experiences, emotions, and the thoughts cannot be easily mixed. To mix them, you need the filament, which is known as the mind of the poet, and then the whole process starts, the process of writing poetry. And when poetry is written at the end of this process, there is no influence of poetry on the mind of the poet, and there is no influence of mind on the poetry which is written by the poet. So the poet's mind remains different from poetry. This is what he wants to say. This is a scientific or objective approach towards poetry. Okay. His conception of tradition is very importantly discussed by T.S. Eliot. What is a tradition? Tradition is made out of hundreds of people. Yes or no? Say for example, William Shakespeare wrote a drama. Someone likes his drama, he follows William Shakespeare. One third person likes his drama, he follows that follower. And this is how, hundreds of people, they keep on writing on one particular theory, on one particular line, and that becomes the tradition of writing drama. Eliot says that while in the process of the creation of poetry, the poet has to surrender himself to that tradition completely. Because you cannot exist in a vacuum. You are not alone in this society. No poet can claim himself as an individual talent. Every artist is always the product of the past artists, the past writers and poets. Okay, every poet is the product of his society, product of the literature which he has read and understood. Every poet is the product of his cultural atmosphere, cultural milieu. But Eliot defines tradition as the collective personality. You know, what is a collective personality? Say, for example, I am one personality, but but why? I am the product of my tradition. Okay, I learned hundreds and thousands of things from the people around me, from the education which I have received, from the books which I have read. So I am the product of all these things, which is known as a collective personality, realized in the literature of the past. Okay, Eliot's conception of tradition is very dynamic. Now, this tradition, collective personality, keeps on changing, and that's why Eliot calls it dynamic. Dynamic means always changing. Okay, this tradition is not fixed, it is not static, it keeps on growing, it keeps on changing and becoming different from what it was. Say, for example, when I write a drama, I follow the tradition of George Bernard Shaw, fine. But as an individual talent, I add something new to that Bernard Shaw's theory of writing drama. So, I am responsible of changing the past traditions of which I am the product. Okay, so you can say that tradition influences the individual talent, and individual talent also influences and changes the tradition. His concept of historical sense is also very important. You know, as I told you, the poet adds something of his own and he influences his own tradition. But for that, the poet has to undergo a lot of toil. Toil means parishram. He has to work very hard. Tradition does not automatically come down to anyone. Okay, to acquire the tradition, to receive the tradition, the poet has to acquire the historical sense. What is this historical sense? Historical sense means a perception, a view, a vision, not only of the past but also of the present. Okay, so as an individual poet, when I want to write poetry, if I want to influence my tradition, if I want to change my tradition, first of all, I must have a proper vision of that collective personality. I must have a proper vision, vision of past and also of present. The poet has not only to be a man well saturated in the literature of the past and present, but he has to generate in him a feeling for all literature as one unit. Okay, so a well-read person, a well-read poet, he takes all literatures of all languages as one collective unit, and that is known as collective personality, and this awareness is known as historical awareness. Okay, now when T.S. Eliot says that tradition influences the individual talent, that doesn't mean that individual talent does not influence the tradition. Okay, Eliot places himself on a very safe ground by saying that the relationship between the tradition and the individual talent is not that of complete subordination of the later to the former. Okay, it is not that when I want to be a great poet, I must surrender myself to the great poets. No, you surrender yourself to the great poets. You learn hundreds of things, hundreds of techniques from them. But at the same time, my new work of art, my poetry is going to influence the past tradition also. Okay, once my poetry is produced, it modifies the tradition as well. Okay, after the publication of new works of art, there is a slight reordering of the whole tradition. And so that's why Eliot says that individual talent also plays an important role in modifying and changing the age-old tradition of writing poetry. And the last point which we must understand is that poetry as an art of organization. Poetry is not a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, as Wordsworth said. T.S. Eliot goes against this theory and he says that poetry does not depend on divine inspiration by God. Instead, it is an art of organization. Organization means arrangement of great number of varied emotions and experiences. The poet has so many experiences in his mind and emotions and thoughts in his mind and heart. And the poet's job is to organize, to arrange them in a proper manner. Hundreds of such emotions, thoughts and experiences which are stored in the poet's mind and heart, they must be mixed together and organized in a proper manner using words and other techniques, and that something new which comes out is called poetry. So the process of writing poetry is actually the process of organizing all different experiences and thoughts. Okay, the greatness of the poem according to T.S. Eliot does not depend on the type of moral messages which poetry offers. Here he goes against Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold during the Victorian era believed that poetry must give some moral messages to the society. But Eliot says that no, the greatness of poetry does not depend on that. Poetry does not depend on the type of moral messages. Poetry also does not depend on the type of emotions or personal emotions, how well they are expressed. But the greatness of poetry according to T.S. Eliot lies in the type of order, harmony and unity with which the poem is written. Okay, so a good poet according to Eliot must have a perfect art of organization. What is to be organized? The emotions, experiences and thoughts of the poet, they must be organized. Now let's conclude the discussion by saying that Tradition and Individual Talent, which is a critical essay written by T.S. Eliot, it saves poetry from the fanciful and whimsical ideas of the Romanticists, who? William Wordsworth and St. Coleridge. This essay tries to show a way to artistic perfection by means of developing historical sense. If a poet wants to write poetry, he has to develop historical sense. Okay, and he must have proper balance between the past and present. Eliot, who lived during the period of science and technology, he adopted scientific approach while defining poetry, and he brushed away all the romantic and moral theories displayed by Wordsworth and Matthew Arnold. In his objective approach to poetry, he has been rightly called as one of the most important pillars of new criticism. I.A. Richards, who is also a great new critic of the 20th century, he said that in one degree or another, we are all the products of Eliot's work. Okay, so I.A. Richards wants to say that we all learned everything from T.S. Eliot. Another critic, Dr. Lewis, he also says that it was on this essay preeminently that was based Eliot's reputation as a great thinker. If you consider Eliot as a great thinker, as a great theorist, it was because of this essay, tradition, and individual talent. And the last critic which I must quote is A.G. George. George wants to say that Eliot's theory of the impersonality of poetry is the greatest theory on the nature of poetic process after Wordsworth's romantic conception of poetry. Okay, so George wants to say that Wordsworth gave a personal approach to poetry, but Eliot came out with his theory of impersonality in poetry, and that is the greatest contribution of T.S. Eliot during the 20th century. I hope the whole idea is clear to you. If you still have any doubts, please do ask your questions in the comment section of this channel, and please subscribe to this channel and share this video among all your friends and classmates. Thank you very much.